Hey, what's up everybody? Welcome to my channel, Do Ministry Gaming, and today we are going to do a build guide on the Bleed Bow Gladiator. As you can see from the intro highlight clips, the Bleed Bow Gladiator is all content viable. It can boss, it can map, it is extremely well-rounded and scales quite nicely. It is also very much League Start viable, and throughout this guide I'll be talking a lot about what you're going to be running in terms of options, gear options, etc. For the League Start option. But it is very nice as a League Start. I did it in 3.13 and it did just fine, cleared all the content and got me a nice little bank of currency for me to start my second character. It is also very nice because you can run split arrow and puncture quite early in the game, and basically from there you're just basically running that one setup all the way through to the end game as far as you'd like to take the character. And so in that sense, it's very nice that you don't have to do any transitions at all. And so I highly recommend it, and that's why I'm putting this build guide together for 3.14. It is one of my top recommended builds for a League starter. So if that is what you're here for, make sure you watch the guide and see what some of those League start options are. But if you're just here for a strong character, this character can scale even quite nicely. Everything you see in the intro clips is with my current gear, which is not even quite min-maxed yet. There is a whole other level you can absolutely take this character to in terms of the end game. And so you can do that if you'd like as well. So without further ado, let's get started. All right, so as usual, we're going to start off with a build overview. You are running a Bleed Bow Gladiator, so you are a ranged character. That in itself is quite nice as a League starter in particular. Then after that, you are using Bleed as your main mechanism for damage. You are comboing with Gladiator, and the reason for that is mostly for Gratuitous Violence, which is a built-in explodey for Bleed, which is very nice for a League start because explodey typically on gear is, relatively speaking, a little more expensive to get and relatively speaking difficult to get early in the league. So with it built into the Ascendancy, that is very nice added bonus in terms of mapping and progressing through the game. Now you are going to be clearing maps with split arrow. As you can see, I've got a lot of projectiles there and the explodey for the map clear, and then puncture in terms of a single target damage. With the single target, puncture is very nice. You put the bleed on the boss and you're free to move around and dodge mechanics as well. There's a very strong interaction when it comes to ensnaring arrow, and by putting that debuff onto the boss, it's as if they were moving even if they're not, so they're taking that additional bleed damage. So that's very nice. And then on the defensive end, it's got an amazing life pool. It's got some very good defensive layers, which I'll talk about in detail, along with Divine Flesh, Keystone, lots of blind capabilities. You have instant war cries for enduring a cry as well, endurance charges. So there are a lot of defensive mechanisms. This build is quite tanky as a result. And so I will go over all that, but overall, this is an amazing build, very good for a League starter, and something that you can play from the beginning all the way to the end without switching, and scales very nicely into the end game until you complete all the content. So I'm going to run over the gem setup really quickly now. For map clear, you're going to be running split arrow linked with chain or awaken chain. Chain gives you +2 chains, and awaken chain gives you +3 chain, which is very nice. Just depends on what you can afford and what you want to run. After that, you're going to link that with chance to bleed, deadly ailments, brutality, and vicious projectiles. All four of these really just for bleed and physical damage. Now for the single target, you will be running puncture. I'm going to show you the 6-link version here, which is what was used for all of the intro highlight clips that you saw. So 6-link definitely does the job. However, there is a particular helmet out there called the Assailum, which gives you a channeling capability on a 4-link puncture, which technically is stronger than the 6-link. But it is a different play style. You do have to channel. And so I'll talk about that in depth when I talk about the gear. But just know that if you're running that helmet, it's more damage, and you'll be running sort of the top 4 gems here. So for the puncture setup, you've got puncture, brutality, vicious projectiles, and deadly ailments. So the 4 that would go into the Assailum Helm if you wanted to run that. Otherwise, you're going to link onto it for the 6th link, chance to bleed and swift affliction. Now onto the auras. The primary aura that you're going to run is Malevolence. This is the more damage over time multiplier. This is pretty much the only blue gem that you're running in your setup. And so the only one that requires intelligence, which is a little bit hard to get, but you are going to need it because you're going to want this gem max. It is a lot more damage at max than if it was not. So make sure you try to get that intelligence, whether it's through the gear or through the tree, to make sure this is as high level as it can be. Next, you're going to run Flesh and Stone for the Blood and Sand stances. In the Blood stance, you're going to do increased damage. In the Sand stance, you're going to be, it'll be a defensive layer. Nearby enemies are blinded, or you take 11% less damage from enemies that are not nearby. So a very nice defensive layer. You can choose which one to run depending on how strong you feel your character is. Then you're also going to run War Banner. This is for the additional biz damage. And then finally, you're going to link all that with Enlighten. Next is your totem setup. This is incredibly important, so make sure you have this setup in your build as soon as you can. You are running Ballista Totem along with Ensnaring Arrow, Greater Multiple Projectiles, and Maim. And the reason why this is so strong is you're going to drop this totem, whether it's for a boss or you can do it with clearing too. You don't need to, but when a boss, you're dropping it. And what Ensnaring Arrow does is, okay, first of all, what bleed does is when your enemy's bleeding, if they're standing still, they take 70% of your base bleed hit damage. If they're moving, they take 210%. So it's a 3 times multiplier if they're moving versus if they're not moving. So you want the enemy to be moving. What Ensnaring Arrow does is it places a debuff on the enemy, and so that even if they're standing still, they are considered moving. So they're always taking that 210% damage. So you want this active on the enemy at all times, especially if there's a boss that doesn't move a lot. This is going to give them, make it so that they take that 210% damage versus 70% damage. So dropping it on a totem makes it very nice. You just put it on the totem, drop the totem in the fight, and it will do the work for you. And then the greater multiple projectiles just makes it easier to hit the enemy or enemies to place this debuff on. And then Maim is just there to give the Maim debuff as well, which enhances your damage, through your Ascendancy as well as Cluster Jewel if you're running any Maim Cluster Jewels. Then finally, for the utility skills, you can really use whatever you want here. I've chosen to run Dash with Second Wind for mobility. This is a very nice combo. And then running Enduring Cry. Now, Enduring Cry is very nice, and I'll talk more about in the passive skill tree. But what you can do is equip it, and you can equip it onto your left click. And it just casts itself instantly anytime that you're moving. And the reason why you can do so you don't have to think about it. And the reason why you can do this is because of this particular keystone here called Call to Arms, which is something you pass by anyway. So for 1 point, it makes your war cries instant, which is what this is. And so you can have it on your left click and not stop at all to cast it. Now, if you didn't have that keystone, it does have a cast time of 0.8 seconds. So basically when you're moving, your character will stop briefly and then move again, which can be annoying. I mean, you could probably learn to play with it, but it is much better with that keystone for sure. And then finally, you're going to run Portal here just for the Portal Scrolls. All right, so we're going to look at the gear now. The first thing we'll look at is the bow. The bow is pretty straightforward. What you're looking for is an Elder bow because Elder can roll the bleed mod, which is the third line here. 60% chance for bleeding to deal 100% more damage. That is an absolute insane mod, incredibly strong, and a must-have as soon as you can reasonably attain it. Now, other than this mod, you're looking for high physical DPS with the lowest attack speed possible. The reason for that is because bleed takes your biggest hit and does the damage over time on that. And so one big hit is what you want rather than a bunch of small hits. And so as a result, usually Citadel bow is the best base for these types of bows because it has the lowest attack speed and the highest fizz damage. Now, the bow that you're looking at here is more of an endgame bow. This is a 420 DPS a physical damage bleed bow. It is not really something you're going to get early in the league as a league start. And so with that in mind, I prepared 5 other bows here to show you. what you can expect in the first week or two of the league. They are 4 of them are uniques. They are ordered from cheapest to most expensive, and also weakest to strongest. So the first two is Chinsol and Lionized Glare. These are roughly the same in terms of power and cost. They are usually pretty cheap at the beginning of the league, with Chinsol being the cheapest. And these will be the first bow that you get into that will be pretty good. So make sure you grab one of these as soon as you can. They is absolute worth what you're going to pay for at the beginning of the league, and will almost certainly be an upgrade to whatever you're using up until this point, unless you're using a very, very well rolled, very good rare bow. Make sure you pick one of these, and this will carry you really up to red maps even, if you'd like. Which doesn't really matter. I mean, they're roughly about the same and roughly about the same cost. So go with the one that you like. The next two are a step up from there, Sliver Tongue and Crimson Storm. These two are roughly about the same in power output as well. They are definitely a step up from Chinsol and Lionized Glare, but they are similar to each other. However, these two bows are usually pretty expensive early in the league. You're looking at multiple exalts to get one of these because they are rare and hard to get. Sliver Tongue, I think, is a Hydra drop, and Crimson Storm is a Syndicate drop, something like that. And so these are very hard to get, and so very expensive. Are they worth the currency to get? That depends on you, how well you're feeling about your currency situation, how cheap these are in the particular league that you're playing. They are, again, very strong upgrades, but usually quite expensive. So maybe not necessarily worth the currency. I never used one in my 3.13 league start and did just fine. But if you have the means, or a good opportunity comes up, or it's very cheap for whatever reason, make sure you step into one of these. Crimson Storm technically, in most cases, is stronger than Sliver Tongue, but they are very comparable, and you won't go wrong with either one of those. And then from there, you will probably step into your first rare bleed bow. The one in my inventory here, Rage Wind, is more of a typical league start bleed bow, something you'll get in the first week or two. This is a 280 DPS bleed bow. I actually crafted this myself, and I actually have a crafting guide on this exact bow, which will be linked in the description below. So make sure you go and check that out if you want to craft your own. They're incredibly easy to craft, as I've shown in my video. So go and check that out. And if the video is not available yet, it will be shortly. But basically, this is a 280 DPS bleed bow you can craft yourself. All of these other bows will be in that 280, 300 plus range DPS. So your DPS will actually be either the same or maybe even slightly less, but you will be getting the bleed mod, which is very strong. In terms of map clear at this point, you're probably not going to see a noticeable difference in terms of clearing speed, because this mod doesn't really impact clear speed that much. But when it comes to single target, which could be something that limits your progress, you will notice a big change going to these rare bows. And from this point on, basically, you're just continuing to get this bleed mod with as high DPS as you can in terms of upgrades. All right, so we're going to talk about the helmet next. I'll actually talk about the one in my inventory first. This is by far and large the more popular option. It's called the Assailum helm, and what it does, it gives you the snipe skill. So whatever skill you have socketed in there, which usually is your 4-link puncture, will get sniped. And basically what snipe does is you can actually channel your puncture skill or whatever's in here up to 6 stacks, and then you get more damage multiplier for each one of those stacks. So if you can get up to 6 stacks, it actually is very strong. It actually makes the 4-link puncture much stronger than the 6-link puncture, actually a normal 6-link puncture setup. So that's why this helmet is actually quite popular. And in a lot of build guides, they'll tell you to use this, as well as it'll say that it's very cheap helmet. So there's a couple things I want to say to that. The first is this helmet used to be very cheap because the drop of this helmet used to actually be bugged up until 3.13. This helm is actually supposed to be a delirium only drop, and so it should be pretty rare. But before 3.13, it was dropping off of everything. And so it was very common, and so it was very cheap. Now, as with 3.13, they have fixed that. And it's now back to only a delirium drop, and the supply is down. And so it actually is quite expensive. Early in the league, in 3.13, I remember these were going at 6 to 7 exalts. So not the, of course, the 1 or 2C that is quoted in a lot of other build guides. So keep that in mind. The second is with Assailum, when you get the snipe off, is very strong, very satisfying. You basically one-shot bosses with your puncture, like I say, stronger than the 6 link. However, I have played with this myself, and it is really a playstyle thing. It's up to you whether you enjoy that playstyle or not. I basically played with this for one day and immediately said I hated it. I'm not the kind that likes to channel a skill, especially in a boss fight. There are some boss fights I find very difficult to channel the skill on, like Maven, where you're kind of dancing around a lot. And so, this is a personal preference. If you're okay with that kind of playstyle, this is absolutely the Helm for you, and is stronger. But if you're not, what I'll say is that's okay. The 6 link puncture does the job. Every clip that you saw in the intro highlights was from a 6 link puncture, which is my current setup, not the Assailum Helm. So don't be worried about the power of the 6 link puncture. It is absolutely enough to do the job and all the in-game content. So whether you run Assailum or not is up to your currency situation. If you feel like it's worth the 6 or 7 exalts that you might have to pay, or how you feel about the channeling. All right, that's enough I'll say about that. Very strong option, nonetheless. If you decide not to go with the Assailum, then you can run something similar to what I'm showing here, which is basically a rare item. The enchant in both cases where you want is probably Split Arrow. Split Arrow can go 2 or 3 additional projectiles, 3 of course being the better one, but more expensive. So in this case, we run 2 here. But otherwise, for the helmet, nothing too special. You're basically looking for a good life roll, resists, and any stat that you are short on. All right, so the next thing we'll talk about, I guess, is the belt here, which is another pretty critical piece of item. What we're running here is the Rithlasos coil. Now, what makes this strong is the second line here, more maximum physical attack damage. Now, there is a negative to this belt too. Which is the third line, less minimum physical attack damage. And I'll explain why this belt is strong. It absolutely is insane. It will be a step change in your damage. You are going to notice and feel it. So I would say get this as soon as you can. This typically is pretty expensive belt as well. But just quickly to explain why that is strong. Okay. Right now I've got 44% more and 36% less. Because I've got the quality modifier on the belt as well, which is a added bonus to this belt. But anyway, if you look at my actual physical damage, you can see here in my tooltips, 641 to 3924, okay? So because the high end of the damage is so much higher than the low end, a more multiplier on the big number is much better than a less multiplier on the small number, right? So let's just say these were 50 and 50, just for simple math. 50% more maximum and 50% less minimum. If I was 50% more on 3,900, I'd be, up to 6,000 on the top end. But if I was 50% less on the low end, I'd be at 300. So it'd actually be 300 to 6,000 versus 600 to 4,000. And so that's why your average damage scales up quite significantly, because the way the math works, your top end is so much higher and a percentage on that is so much bigger than a percentage on the low end. And that's why that's strong. It also adds fizz damage and life. So this belt is very, very good. One of the first upgrades I would say you're going to want if you want to spike in power. All right, so from here on out, the rest of the gear is pretty standard. For the chest piece, you can run Belly of the Beast. The percent maximum life, that is a lot of life and got some nice resist and flash recovery rate. You are going to probably want to run this if you want the sort of life totals of 6k plus. Very nice life. Otherwise, you can certainly run a rare chest here with just some life and resist. And that will be a pretty common theme from here on out. For the boots, you're just getting your movement speed, your life, and your resist. For the amulet, life, and resist, you can also get a couple things on the amulet that are quite nice, which is flat fizz to attacks, as well as physical damage over time multiplier. But I think the important things to talk about here is the anointment. So for the anointment, I've gone with growth and decay, which is probably your best damage anointment you can get on the amulet, with damage over time, percent damage over time and damage over time multiplier. However, this anointment is quite expensive. I think it costs 2 golden oils to actually get. Oh, just one. But alternatively, if you want some more defensive options, you can, of course, go with a discipline and training as well, which is life, percent life. You can also go with crystal skin, which is down here, all res, max res, avoid elemental ailments. So those are some nice options as well. And then on to the rings. You are basically flat fizz damage if you can, and then life resists. Here, life resists. On one of these two rings, though, you're going to want vulnerability on hit. So whichever one doesn't really matter. If you want to get it on a steel ring, it will be quite expensive anytime in the league, pretty much. So, um, if you want it cheaper, you can get it on an alternative ring. But basically, life and resist, and make sure one of them has the vulnerability on hit. Now, the Quiver is where you can actually get a lot of damage pieces. So Quiver, what you're actually going to want here is, if you can get it, there's 2 damage over time multipliers that apply that you can get on the Quiver. The regular damage over time multiplier and the physical damage over time multiplier. So attempt or try to get both of those, and then the other things that you'll want on here are life, resist. Now, there's +2 max chaos res on my Quiver. This is very good for this particular build because of the Transcendent Flesh node, which I'll go over in the passive tree. But basically, max chaos res and chaos resistance itself is very strong if you're going to run the timeless jewel that I'm running in my setup. Then finally, the gloves, same thing, life resist if you're short on any of those, but otherwise gloves can get you some decent damage as well with the grip gloves. With also gloves can roll physical damage over time multiplier. It can also roll projectile attack damage. Calling strike is a big one if you can get it, but very flexible. Like I say, depending on where you are in your league and your character in terms of what you want here, rolling just life and resist on gloves is perfectly reasonable as well. All right, so we'll talk about the flasks now. Flasks are extremely flexible. There's nothing here that you absolutely need to have, but these are what I've run here. The first is a life flask of staunching for the bleed. Typically, obviously, more popular is the seething life flask of staunching, but I've run a catalyzed eternal life flask here. It doesn't matter, whatever floats your boat, just something to kind of top you up when you need it. The next I've run Rumi's Concoction. The block, you can never say no to that when you have a flask slot to spare. Then I'm running a Quicksilver Flask of Warding for the movement speed. And I typically like my warding on my Quicksilver Flask. It just seems to make more sense to me that way. In terms of uptime, but you can obviously get that anywhere you want. The next is a Quartz Flask of the Heat for the freezing. And then the dodge and the phasing is absolutely amazing. So I highly recommend as a defensive flask as well. And then finally, I am running a mana flask of dousing. You don't need it. You have mana leech on the tree, so you absolutely don't need it. I just hate running out of mana. I hate being stuck in a situation where I don't have enough. And so I run this when I feel that way, and I'm doing that. Now, you can literally run any flask that you want, however you want, more defensive, less defensive, whatever you want. It honestly, that's what's nice about this build, is the amount of flexibility when it comes to the gear as well as the flasks. And that's why it's a great league starter. There's not that many good offensive flask options. I mean, there's Dying Sun for additional projectiles, but you really don't need it. If you look at your split shot, you're already at, what's that, 9 projectiles maybe? Another couple isn't going to be that huge of a difference. But if you want to run it, absolutely. Cinder Swallow is also a very good option. Of course, that gives you the onslaught plus some other nice stuff. So you can run that, but that's typically a pretty expensive flask. So in league start situation, you don't need it. That's okay. So, these are the 5 that I run, but you can really run anything here you want. All right, on to the passive tree. The first thing we will talk about is the Ascendancy. The Ascendancy you are running is Gladiator, and for primarily this reason, gratuitous violence, this node is pretty good. It is bleeding enemies you kill explode, basically exploding for bleed, and 20% more damage with bleed. And so this is very nice, especially in a league start situation, because you have exploding basically built into your Ascendancy. You don't have to spend any currency to get it, which typically is, relatively speaking, expensive to get on your gear. And so getting that early on in the league is very nice in terms of map clears and getting your character rolling. To get to that, of course, you'll need to get Blood in the Eyes. This node is pretty strong as well. Chance to bleed, and then maim on hit. And then on the last line there, maimed enemies take 10% increased phys damage. So that's basically a more multiplier on maimed enemies, which is very nice. And maim itself is very defensive, given that it slows movement speed down by 30%. Maimed targets, that is. And then 25% chance to blind against bleeding enemies. So blind is also a very nice defensive layer on your character, and it combos as well with the blood and sand or that you are running. Then Arena Challenger gives you the challenge charges, which gives you basically the attack and movement speed, and you gain charges when you're in Sand Stance, as well as when you hit a rare or unique enemy in Blood Stance. And then finally, Outmatch and Outlasted. You are running a bow, so you don't really have an offhand, so you're not gaining endurance charges with the offhand, which is the second line there, but you are getting frenzy charges on kill with your bow, and then you're also doing 10% more physical damage at maximum frenzy charge, which is very nice. And then also taking reduced physical damage while you're at maximum endurance charges, which you will be at with this build, which is another defensive layer, is endurance charges. So this basically enhances that. Onto the rest of the passive tree, you're basically starting as the duelist, of course. You're going to path out here. There are some life nodes over here that you can grab to the left. Very nice. Then you come down here. Deadly Draw is a very nice bleed bow cluster, so make sure you grab those 3 nodes there. Over to the right here is some sort of defensive stuff. Wind Dancer, Keystone. You don't have to take this. A lot of people don't like it, but I have it in my build here. One of the reasons why you would come over here, I think it's pretty good, as well as these life notes here with the added quality of life of avoid elemental ailments. And if you haven't heard me talk about it before, I think it's a very nice quality of life and very underappreciated. So grabbing some of that over here is certainly nice. And this is also where you get your mana leech. 1 point to get life and mana leech here. So that's where that's come from. And so coming over here is for that reason. Next is the rest of the tree over as you path over left to the Marauder area. A lot of that is going to be life, but you're going to come over here. Coming down to Dirty Techniques, there's also a nice bleed node, bleed cluster down here. You're going to move through Cloth and Chain. You can also move through the Frenzy Charges, doesn't matter there, but this is additional resist, which is quite nice. Then you come over here, Life Cluster with the Glowing Blood, Socket, Endurance Charge, which is like, say, a defensive layer. Come up here, grab Bloodletting for sure. This is very strong for a bleed, this cluster here. Then you're going to come up here. You're going to grab the life wheel here for lots of life. In this jewel socket, this is where you can run your timeless jewel, and the one you want to run is Glorious Vanity with Zibaqua. And the reason for that is it turns the keystone into the divine flesh. Now, a couple things. If you don't know what a timeless jewel is, I do have a guide on that explaining it in detail, a lot of detail, in the Legion mechanic guide. So make sure to go and check that out if you're curious about what these jewels do. But if you already know, Divine Flesh is what this keystone turns into. And this is incredibly strong. All damage taken bypasses an energy shield. Not good, but you don't have a lot of energy shield. You're primary life base. But then the good things are 50% elemental damage taken as chaos damage, and then +5 max chaos res. So if you're able to get to max chaos resistance. So in this case, I have actually 82 chaos resistance, max chaos res, 75 plus the 5 from the Divine Flesh, plus 2 from my Quiver. So I'm at 82, and I've got that maxed out because a lot of the rare gear I have chaos resist on. Basically, what that would mean if you have it set up that way is that 50% of my elemental damage, rather than taking them at 75% resistance, I'm actually taking them at 82 percent resistance, which is a massive, massive defensive layer. So Divine Flesh, highly recommended in this jewel socket. There are a lot of build guides that don't actually run it. I don't know why. This is absolutely very strong. A noticeable jump in defense when you get it, and have your chaos resist maxed out, and not hard to do when you're running a lot of rares with just resist. So very, very strong. Highly recommended. Then you're going to path over here. You're going to grab the Bloodless life cluster here, down here. Call to Arms, very good for 1 point when you're pathing by it. War Cries are instant. And as you've seen in the gem setup, I'm running Enduring Cry on the left click, and it just basically procs instantly every time it's up. So very, very nice to run war cries that way whenever I can. Really, I path through Call of Arms, I do grab it for that reason. Then we're gonna path up here, continue path up here. Just a lot of you know, damage over time clusters with Red Storm and life clusters. Such as the Juggernaut here, grab the Endurance Charge. Now for this socket, this is where you're going to run Lionized Fall. This is a huge, massive damage upgrade for how much this jewel is worth, even early league. So get this jewel as soon as you can, as soon as you have enough points to actually get it and get all these nodes. But basically with it, it turns everything that's melee into a bow modifier. So you can grab this entire axe wheel, which is very good. Along the top here is bleeding damage nodes. With cleaving being a lot of fizz damage and bleed damage, and along the bottom is a lot of ailment damage nodes, which of course bleeding is an ailment as well, and fizz damage. So this wheel here is very good. Slaughter also gives you onslaught on kill, which is very nice. So make sure you grab that wheel, and then over here the Razor's Edge cluster over here for a lot more bleed damage as well. Then you path up for the more life. Then you get here, make sure you grab Resolute Technique. This is very good in terms of not having you to run any accuracy. You can never crit, but that's fine. You don't need it in this particular build. If you path the other way or run some other setup, you cannot grab this, of course, but in this build you will. And then you're going to grab this cluster, and I will talk about the cluster jewels. All right, so now we're going to talk about the cluster jewel setup. Here in the large cluster jewel, there's really only one, I would say, that is quote unquote mandatory, and that would be tempered arrowheads. Tempered arrowheads is very nice, gives 10% damage over time multiplier, 20% increased skill effect duration, and 10% increased duration of ailments while wielding a bow, which you are. So make sure your large cluster jewel has this one. Everything else is optional. You can see mine is still very much a league start one, but you can get to 8 passive skills on the large cluster, and you can get to 3 notables. Now, I am running Devastator. It is by no means mandatory. What Devastator gives is another Explodey, and you already have that from your Ascendancy, so you do not need this. I got this. It gets the attack damage and the ailment damage as well. I put it on. I don't know if it's a placebo effect, but it did feel slightly better, but I doubt it. So don't prioritize this. I would say Tempered Arrowheads is really the only one you need to prioritize. In terms of the other 2 notables, if you want to go triple notable cluster jewel, there are so many options. So basically anything that gives fizz damage, bleed damage, ailment damage, any of that. So there are so many options: heavy hitter, martial prowess, feed the fury, master the fundamentals, battle hardened, force multiplier, you name it, there are tons. So go and have a look. In terms of the large cluster jewel, nothing too important there. But if you can get the triple, obviously will be very good damage. Now, in terms of the medium cluster jewels, there are a couple that are particularly strong. Rend is very good. A Rend being 12% damage over time multiplier for bleeding and 30% increased bleeding duration, and Vivid Hues, which is damage over time multiplier for bleeding. Basically, on the medium cluster jewel, there's a few options there as well, but try to get the ones that give you damage over time multiplier is what you're looking for on those medium jewels. So this one I have Rend and Vivid Hues, and on this one here I've got Vivid Hues and Disorienting Wounds. Disorienting Wounds being 25% chance to blind against bleeding enemies. So if you recall, there was 25% chance from the Ascendancy as well, and then 25% here, and then some blind from your Blood and Sand aura. And so you've got a very high blind against bleeding enemies, which is a nice defensive layer. So that's what I'm running. But long story short, medium cluster jewels run anything with damage over time multiplier. And then finally, with your regular jewels, I did run one Abyss jewel. Abyss jewel being the ones that lets you get phasing and onslaught on kill. You don't actually need either of those on this jewel. You're getting onslaught on kill from this slaughter axe node here, 10% chance here, and you're getting phasing from your flask. So you don't need either. But I did get it. It is just a little bit nicer to have it on the jewel as well, and then got some life on the jewel, but you absolutely don't need it at all. You can put whatever you want there. And then for the anything that you are running a regular jewel on, just get percent life. If you need resist, get that. Damage with bleeding, pretty much anything with bleeding and fizz damage. So that is all. There's one more thing I guess I want to mention here is this jewel socket down here. Um, one other option also is to run a Thread of Hope here, which allows you to get 3 notables that you otherwise wouldn't be able to get. The first is Discipline and Unyielding, which is +1 minimum endurance charges and chance to gain endurance charge on kill, and damage for endurance charge, which you're going to have 5 of. So that's pretty nice. Discipline of Slaughter, +1 minimum frenzy charge on kill, damage per frenzy charge, which you're going to have up as well. And then finally, a Versatile Stance, which is additional damage and blood stance. Or if you're running Sand Stance, increase area effect, which doesn't do anything, I guess. Or if you've changed stats recently, attack speed. So these 3 you can get with one singular Thread of Hope here. And if you ran that there, I would definitely get those 3 notables. So for the Pantheon, you will be running Soul of Lunaris for the additional projectile avoidance, and Soul of Rislatha is quite nice for the life flask recovery, especially if you're regularly doing Cyrus. As for the bandits, you will be running 2 additional skill points for the bandits. All right, everybody, that should be everything you need to know to get started with the Bleed Bow Gladiator, which I am recommending as one of the top league start builds. So I used it in 3.13 and it went very well. So if you're planning for 3.14, I imagine you will have a very good experience as well. I will be putting out 1 or 2 other league start build guides, in particular Toxic Rain Pathfinder, which I find is also a very smooth sailing league start. So make sure you look out for that if that's not already out on my channel. But otherwise, that's a wrap. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed the video. And if you did, please like and subscribe. I also stream on Twitch Tuesdays, Thursdays, and Saturdays. Times are in the description below. Thanks again, and I'll see you next time.